He was just a broke guy chasing a job, but when he gave up his interview to help a stranger, he had no idea who she really was. What she did next, no one saw coming. This one act of kindness changed his life forever. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. He didn't know this one choice would change his life. It was pouring rain. Not just the kind that makes you wet, but the kind that soaks you to the bone, turning sidewalks into rivers and your clothes into heavy, dripping weights. James was sprinting through the heart of downtown, weaving between strangers with umbrellas, his shoes slapping against the pavement. In his hands, he clutched a worn, plastic folder, the kind you'd find at a dollar store. Inside was a single, slightly wrinkled sheet of paper, his only printed resume. He'd reviewed it 100 times that week, memorizing every word, hoping someone, anyone, would look past his unemployment gap, his lack of a college degree, and see him. Just one chance. That's all he wanted. James had been out of work for nearly a year. His savings were long gone. He was crashing on a friend's couch, doing odd jobs for food, and wearing a second-hand suit that didn't quite fit right. But today felt different. Today was the interview. And not just any interview. A real corporate position, entry-level, sure, but stable. With benefits, growth, a future he could barely contain. The mix of nerves and hope that churned in his stomach. As he neared the intersection in front of the office building, he glanced down at his watch. 9:43 a.m. He had just enough time to dry off, check in at the front desk, and gather himself before the 10 o'clock interview. Then, he saw her at the corner of 8th and Grand. An older woman had slipped on the slick sidewalk. Her grocery bags had burst open, spilling apples, milk, and canned goods across the street. Her umbrella was snapped in half, and her coat was soaked. She winced in pain, gripping her ankle, trying to sit up as people rushed past her, eyes down, shoulders up, pretending not to see. James slowed down. His heart was racing, not just from the run now, but from the decision hanging in front of him. Keep going. You can't miss this interview. That was the voice in his head. He looked back at the office entrance. It was right there, just across the street. Clean, dry, opportunity. But then he looked back at the woman. She was older, fragile. Her hands were shaking as she tried to gather her groceries on her own, wincing with every move. And not a single person had stopped. James sighed. His shoulders dropped. He didn't even think twice after that. He jogged over and knelt beside her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm despite the rush of adrenaline still surging through him. She looked up at him, surprised. Rain streaked down her face, mixing with tears. She hadn't even realized she was crying. I think I hurt my ankle," she said, wincing again. James helped her sit up against a nearby bench. "Let me help you," he said gently, picking up the groceries one by one from the flooded sidewalk. The milk had burst. The bread was soggy, but the cans and apples were still usable. He placed them back into one of the bags, then pulled off his own jacket and held it over her to block the rain. She looked at him with watery eyes. "You're getting soaked." James smiled. "I was already soaked." He glanced at his watch again. 9:52 a.m. There was no way he'd make it now. He raised his hand and flagged down a cab, waving desperately until one finally pulled over. "I'll take care of the fare," James said, helping the woman into the back seat. "Wait," she said, grabbing his wrist. "You're going to miss something important, aren't you?" James hesitated. "I had an interview. But it's okay. You needed help more." She stared at him, lips parted, surprised by his calm. "What's your name?" "James," he replied. She gave him one last look, an almost unreadable expression, like gratitude mixed with something deeper, and the cab drove off into the storm. James stood there in the rain, drenched from head to toe, his folder clutched at his side, water leaking in from every direction. That he turned around slowly and walked toward the office building anyway, not because he thought they'd still see him, but because it was the only thing he had left to do. The interview could wait. She needed help. James didn't pause to think. His instinct kicked in as he rushed across the street toward the woman sprawled on the wet sidewalk. Cars splashed past, uncaring, their tires slicing through the puddles, spraying cold water into the air. She was elderly, maybe in her early 70s, with short gray hair plastered to her forehead by the rain. Her hands trembled as she tried to gather her scattered groceries. Apples rolling down the street, a crushed loaf of bread, a leaking carton of eggs. Her umbrella was twisted beyond saving. James dropped to his knees beside her, ignoring Hal. The cold water instantly soaked through his slacks. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern as he gently touched her shoulder. He was already scooping up cans and soggy items, placing them back into a half-torn grocery bag. She looked up, startled. Her eyes, though lined with age, were wide and frightened. I think I twisted my ankle," she said, trying to shift but gasping at the pain. James glanced down. Her foot was slightly turned, and she was favoring it with every movement. "All right, don't move too much," he said softly. "Let me help you sit up." He slid one arm behind her back and the other under her arm and helped her slowly sit upright on the bench just a few feet away. Rain poured relentlessly, and James, without thinking, shrugged off his only jacket and held it over her to block the downpour. Cold drops rolled down his neck, soaking through his thin dress shirt. He winced slightly from the chill but didn't move. "Let's get you out of this rain," he said as he raised his arm, trying to flag down a taxi. At first, none stopped. Most just sped by, the drivers too focused on escaping the storm. But James didn't give up. He waved harder, stepping halfway into the street. Finally, a yellow cab slowed down and pulled over. James opened the door, helped the woman to her feet gently, and guided her into the back seat. She winced again, but held his hand tightly for balance. The driver looked back. "Where to?" "Mercy Hospital," James said without hesitation. "That'll be $18, maybe more with traffic." James hesitated for just a second. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet that was nearly empty. Inside were two crumpled bills, a $10 and a $20. He stared at the $20 for a moment, knowing it was all he had left until, well, he didn't even know when. That was lunch, dinner, maybe bus fare tomorrow. But none of that mattered right now. That he pulled the $20 out and handed it over. "Keep the change," he said quietly. The driver nodded. As James helped the woman into the seat, she grabbed his hand again and looked at him. Her expression had changed. That was no longer just pain or confusion. It was wonder. And something deeper. Something like gratitude with a hint of disbelief. "Thank you, young man," she said softly. "What's your name?" "James," he said, forcing a smile through the shivers starting to ripple through him. "I was actually on my way to a job interview." Her eyes widened. "You skipped your interview for me?" He chuckled slightly, looking down at his soaked shoes. "It's okay. You looked like you needed help more." She opened her mouth, as if to say something more, but the cab door closed gently. Through the rain-covered window, she stared at him as the car pulled away, her face slowly disappearing behind streaks of water and city lights. And just like that, she was gone. James stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, his shirt clinging to his skin, hair dripping, folder of now soggy resume papers under his arm, and heart sinking. He didn't need to check his watch. He knew it was too late. His one shot at a better life. A stable job. Maybe even a desk of his own, a way out of. The struggle was gone. All because he chose to help a stranger. But even as that heavy realization settled in, there wasn't regret. Sure, he was heartbroken. His stomach twisted at the thought of explaining this to his friend when he got home. Another opportunity. Lost. Another almost. But there was also something else, a strange calm. Because deep down, he knew he had done the right thing. And sometimes, doing the right thing meant sacrificing what you wanted most. The company. The interview. Gone. Even though James had missed his chance, something deep inside told him to go anyway. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe he just couldn't bear the thought of giving up completely. He walked the final block to the tall glass building that towered over the street like a monument to success. He'd passed it so many times before, dreaming of what it might feel like to walk through those doors as someone who belonged. Now, soaked to the skin, clutching a dripping folder full of rain-smeared paper, James pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth of the lobby hit him instantly. The polished marble floor gleamed. A security guard looked up, raising an eyebrow. Across the room, behind a modern reception desk, a young woman in business attire glanced over, her polite smile faltering slightly when she saw his condition. James approached her slowly. water dripping from his sleeves onto the floor. "Hi," he said, clearing his throat. I, I had an interview scheduled. 10 o'clock. For the entry-level operations assistant position. She looked at the wall clock. 10:27 a.m. Her eyes moved. Down to his clothes. Then to the soggy folder in his hand. Still, she stayed professional. Name? James Miller. She typed into her computer. The keys clacked sharply in the silence of the clean, corporate space. After a moment, she looked up. "Sir, I'm sorry, but the interviews ended about 15 minutes ago. The hiring manager has already left." James's heart sank. He nodded slowly. "I understand. I know I'm late. I had to help someone on the way here. It was kind of an emergency." The receptionist gave him a small, sympathetic smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She was used to excuses. Everyone who missed their shot had a story. "I'm really sorry," she said softly. "We had a tight schedule today. There were a lot of candidates." James wanted to beg, to explain, to tell her everything. The old woman in the street, the groceries, the cab fare, the $20 he had given without blinking. How he chose kindness over a job, but he didn't, because he knew how it would sound. He knew what the world often saw. When it looked at someone like him, a young black man in a wet suit, late for something important, probably full of excuses. So instead, he gave her a quiet nod. "Thanks anyway." He turned and walked back toward the doors. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the clouds still hung low and gray. James stepped out onto the sidewalk and just stood there, not moving, not thinking, just breathing. He looked up at the building. Its shiny glass exterior reflected the city around it, a place full of rushing people, deadlines, ambitions. Inside, people were going about their days. Phones ringing, meetings happening, coffee being poured. And here he was, alone, cold, soaked, and defeated. That he didn't cry. He wanted to, but the tears just wouldn't come. There was something heavier than tears in his chest. Maybe it was the weight of everything. The hunger, the rejection, the months of trying and failing, the hundreds of unanswered applications, the awkward silences in interviews where he tried to hide how desperate he really was. But today hurt worse than any of those, because this time, he had the interview. He had the chance. And he lost it, because he chose to help. That evening, back at his friend's apartment, the silence felt unbearable. James walked in without saying much. His friend, Marcus, glanced up from the couch, eyes searching his face. "How'd it go?" Marcus asked, hopeful. James didn't answer. He just shook his head and walked past, straight into the small bedroom that wasn't really his. He laid down on the couch, without changing out of his wet clothes. He didn't eat, didn't scroll his phone, didn't speak. He just lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling above him. The sound of raindrops tapped gently against the window. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. 100 thoughts raced through his mind, but none stayed long. Just one question kept returning like a whisper. Did I make the right choice? He didn't know. All he knew was he'd traded the one thing he wanted for the one thing he believed in. And now, he had nothing to show for it. She walks in, and everything changes. 2 days passed. James tried to move on, but the weight of that missed opportunity lingered like a storm cloud over his every thought. He kept replaying the moment, seeing the woman on the ground, choosing to help, handing over his last $20, and wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He didn't tell anyone the full story. Not even Marcus. What was the point? It wouldn't bring the interview back. Then his phone rang. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. James hesitated. He almost didn't answer. He'd been dodging bill collectors for weeks. But something told him to pick it up. "Hello," he said cautiously. A calm, professional voice responded. "Is this James Miller?" His heart jumped. Yes. "Who's calling?" "This is Anderson and Lane Corporation," the voice said. "We'd like to invite you back for a personal meeting with our executive office." James blinked, confused. "Wait, what? I thought I missed my interview." There was a pause. "Yes," the voice said. "And that's exactly why our CEO wants to meet you." James's breath caught in his throat. "The CEO?" "Yes. Can you come in tomorrow morning at 9? He could barely speak. "Why, yes. Yes. I'll be there." He hung up, staring at the screen like it was a dream. His heart was pounding. He had no idea what was happening, but something about this felt big. The next morning, James stood outside the glass building once again. Only this time, he wasn't dripping wet or defeated. He wore a clean, borrowed suit, a little too tight in the shoulders, but freshly pressed. He had polished shoes, combed hair, and the slightest hint of cologne he found in Marcus's bathroom. But most importantly, he had hope. He took a deep breath and walked through the doors with his head held high. The receptionist recognized him. This time, her smile was wider, genuine. "They're expecting you," she said, rising from her seat. "Follow me, please." He was led past the lobby, through a long hallway with framed awards and company photos, and into an elevator. The numbers climbed higher than he expected, way past the floor where the original interview had been held. They reached the top. When the elevator doors opened, James stepped into a sleek office suite that overlooked the entire city. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A large plaque on the wall read, "Margaret Lane, CEO." And there she was, the woman from the street. Only now, she wasn't wet or struggling with groceries. She was dressed in a tailored business suit, her silver hair neatly styled, sitting behind a massive walnut desk with a quiet confidence that filled the room. James froze. His jaw dropped slightly, his brain trying to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. Margaret looked up and smiled warmly. "James." He stepped forward slowly. "Why you? You're the woman from the street." "I am," she said, standing and walking around the desk to greet him. "And you are the young man who gave up his one shot for a stranger." James swallowed hard. "I didn't know who you were. I just saw someone who needed help." She nodded. "Exactly. That's why you're here." He furrowed his brow. "I don't understand." "Why me?" Margaret motioned for him to sit as she returned to her chair. "James, I've spent over 30 years building this company. I've interviewed hundreds, maybe thousands, of candidates. Most of them have great resumes, smooth words, impressive degrees." She leaned in slightly. "But very few show me the one thing you did without ever saying a word." "What's that?" "A good heart." James felt emotion rising in his chest. "You gave up everything that day," she continued. "Your interview, your only money, your comfort, all for someone you didn't know. That kind of integrity can't be taught. It's who you are." He stared at her, overwhelmed. "I thought I ruined everything." Margaret smiled. "No, James. You revealed everything." She opened a folder on her desk and slid it across to him. "I want to offer you the job you applied for. But that's not all. I want to mentor you personally. I see potential in you. And I don't just mean in business. I see leadership, compassion, grit, the kind of soul this world needs more of." James sat frozen, unable to speak. The tears he hadn't shed 2 days ago now burned quietly behind his eyes that he finally managed to whisper, "Thank you." Margaret nodded, her smile unwavering. "No, James. Thank you for reminding me what real character looks like." From broke to boss in training, 6 months later, James stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, 20 stories up, watching the city buzz with life below. He didn't recognize this version of himself. Not entirely. Gone were the days of cold nights on his friend's couch, skipping meals to stretch a few dollars, or walking into interviews with worn shoes and desperation in his eyes. Now he wore a clean, tailored suit. His suit. His name was engraved on the office ID card that hung from his neck. He had a desk, a company laptop, and a steady paycheck that arrived like clockwork every 2 weeks. But more than that, James had something he never imagined he'd find in a corporate world: respect. The journey hadn't been easy. On his first day at Anderson and Lane, he'd been nervous, terrified, even. He kept thinking they'd realize they'd made a mistake, that they'd see he didn't belong. But Margaret Lane never let that fear take root. True to her word, she mentored him personally. She met with him weekly, introduced him to senior staff, gave him books to read, lessons to learn, and real challenges to solve. She pushed him hard, not out of doubt, but because she believed in him. "You have potential," she had said that first day. But potential means nothing without discipline and heart. James had taken those words to heart. He showed up early, stayed late, took notes, asked questions, and when he made mistakes, and he did, he owned them and learned fast. The staff began to notice. The kid who once walked in soaking wet, late for an interview, became one of the most dedicated people in the building. He didn't have a business degree. He didn't come from money. But he had drive. He had character. And he had a story no one could forget. By the end of his first quarter, Margaret pulled him aside and said simply, We're putting you on a leadership track." James had blinked, stunned. "Me? Already?" She smiled. "Yes, because leaders don't wait until they have titles to act like leaders. You showed me your heart before I even knew your name. That matters more than you know." Now, James lived in a small but clean one-bedroom apartment across town. The walls weren't cracked, and the lights always worked. He had a full fridge, a real bed, and a shelf full of books Margaret had recommended. His old friends didn't quite believe the transformation. Some said he got lucky. Others called it fate. But James knew better that IT wasn't luck. It was a choice. That rainy morning, when everything in him screamed to keep running toward the interview, he had made a split-second decision to stop, to help, to be human, even when the cost was everything. And that one moment, that one selfless choice, had rewritten his entire future. Point one day, as James walked home from work, he saw a man on the sidewalk, homeless, shivering under a thin blanket. Most people passed by without looking. James paused. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the sandwich he had picked up for dinner, and handed it to the man without saying a word. The man looked up, eyes wide. "You sure?" James nodded. "I'm sure." As he walked away, he smiled to himself, because in that small act, he saw a reflection of his own story. He remembered the rain, the umbrella, the pain of handing over his last $20, and the unimaginable grace that followed. That he knew now. Kindness wasn't weakness. It was power. Margaret once told him, "The world will always test your heart, James. It will try to harden you, make you selfish, bitter, cold, but don't let it. Every time you choose to be kind, you take a step closer to becoming the man you were meant to be." She was right. James hadn't just found a job. He'd found his worth, his purpose, his place. And he knew this was only the beginning. Point one day, he'd pay it forward. Maybe he'd lead a department, maybe even the company. But no matter where he ended up, he'd never forget where it started, on a rainy sidewalk, with a broken umbrella, and a stranger who turned out to be his future. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because here, we tell the stories that remind us what really matters: heart, hope, and humanity. Until next time, stay kind, and keep believing that one moment can change everything. Folded hands, Dizzy.